So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Australia-Brazil Alumni Leadership Conference, co-hosted by the Embassy of Australia in Brazil and the Australian National University. Thank you for joining us today on our third session of this series. I would like to begin our session with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on those traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elder past, present and emerging. A Embaixada da Austrália no Brasil apresenta essa série de webinars 2020 em parceria com a Australian National University, que é a universidade número 1 da Austrália, de acordo com o ranking QS. Essa semana e semana que vem, a ANU traz especialistas renomados mundialmente para apresentações que vão apoiar o seu desenvolvimento profissional. Meu nome é Ana Paula, and I'm part of the Brazilian alumni community in Australia, a former student of the ANU. I'm the regional manager for Brazil in the marketing and recruitment division of the ANU, and I'll be moderator of the session tonight. Let's start just with some quick housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded and may be broadcasted on ANU TV on YouTube. We also encourage everyone to participate. Your cameras and microphones were muted on entry, but please raise your hand. There is a function on Zoom for you to raise your hand if you would like to speak, and we can unmute you. We can also enable your video. If you want to send a question to our panelists, you can use the Q&A function. If you look on the bottom of your screen, there is a function Q&A where you can send your questions. Our panelists, please, if you want to keep an eye on that session, if you want to type some questions in, feel free if you would like to address them as well. We are going to address most of the questions after the presentations tonight. You can use the chat to comment on the presentations. And now let's start introducing our speakers for tonight. We are going to discuss leadership in driving economic reform with the presentations of Professor Robert Breunig and Professor Nicholas Biddle. If you have any questions, again, just reminding you, send it through the Q&A function. Professor Breunig, I think I'll start with you. Professor Breunig is the director of the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the ANU. I believe you have made significant policy impact through a number of your research projects, Professor. Relationship between childcare and women's labor, effect of immigration in Australia. Well, I welcome you, Professor, and please, what topic do you bring to our audience tonight?
Thanks, Ana Paula, for the introduction. It's very nice to be here, and boa noite to all the participants in Brazil. I was supposed to have traveled to Brazil at the end of April, and unfortunately COVID-19 forced me to postpone that trip. And I was really looking forward to getting back to Brazil. I've been there once before, and I had a fabulous time. I was very impressed by the hospitality of people, the food, and I thought Brazil, Brazil is a good example of a multi-ethnic country where people of lots of different languages and backgrounds can work together to make things happen. So I'm a real optimist when it comes to Brazil, and I think the future will have good things for Brazil, even if the current time is a bit difficult. So Ana Paula, I'm going to talk about a theme that I've been working on for the past couple of years, which is called hybrid public policy. And I actually wrote a book 2 years ago about this. And the idea of hybrid public policy is to sort of bring together the best of government and the best of the marketplace in designing policy. So I have a few slides which I might share, and then I can talk through that. I'll talk for 15 minutes or so. So let's see if this works. Okay, can you see that okay? Excellent. Okay. So now let's see if I can make the slides go up and down. So this is based on a book that I wrote with one of my PhD students, Mark Fabian, who is now actually at Cambridge. A very successful ANU PhD student who's now got a job at another top university. So the main theme of our book is this idea of hybrids, and the idea of a hybrid is sophisticated combinations of government, market, and community tools to try to achieve both efficiency outcomes and equity outcomes simultaneously. And linked very closely to this is the idea of evidence-based policy. So the idea is that you want to try to design policy with clear objectives that you're trying to achieve. You want to be able to measure and track those objectives. And then you want to discover when policy is working and when policy is not working. And you want to try to move resources from policies that don't work to policies that do work. The vision that we have in many ways is very idealistic. However, we have a lot of concrete examples in the book where people have implemented this, and it's done pretty well. And I think countries that one can look to if you're interested in these kind of policies are Australia. I think Australia actually has quite a few policies that have this flavor of policy design in them, and we've done it very successfully. And then the Scandinavian countries have also done this. And a large part of doing this involves actually, in some ways, setting ideology to the side. So our vision is somewhat technocratic in that sense. And I think, when Australia and Scandinavian countries have come up with really good policy solutions, they've often been done in a non-ideological way where both sides of politics work together to achieve a set of outcomes that people recognize as being important. And I can talk a little bit about this. So, if you think about what the two goals of public policy are, the first one is the idea of efficiency. Resources are scarce, and we have to make the most of what we've got. And when we think about efficiency, we want to think about, what's going to maximize people's well-being. So I'm not talking about efficiency here just strictly in a monetary sense, but in a broader well-being sense. And obviously a big part of that is economic growth. If you look at the trajectory of the last 100 years, we've had incredible success around the planet where economic growth has led to great reductions in poverty. We've seen those reductions in poverty happen in Latin America. We've seen them happen in Asia. We're starting to see them happen in Africa. And we're now at a point where, 50 years ago, about a third of the world's people lived on $1 a day. Today, that number is less than 5%. So while there is still poverty, we know that the way to eliminate it, the best way to eliminate it, and the way that's been successful is through economic growth. So government policy has to position a country to grow for the well-being of its people. And then, of course, another goal of public policy is equity. So we don't just want to grow for growth's sake. And sometimes growth can end up concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. So we want to make sure there's a fair distribution of resources. Now, of course, people are going to disagree about how much is fair and the right amount of redistribution. But I think it's I think one can take a pretty middle of the road stance that says we want some redistribution, we want some inequality because we want some incentive for people to work hard and do better, but we also want to share the benefits of growth amongst everybody in society. And I think, for example, if you look at some of the things that are happening in the US and the kind of, the US has grown tremendously because of trade and because of openness, but there's a real backlash against that at the moment. And that's not a backlash we're seeing in Australia. And one reason I think for that is that the US government has not done a good job of taking that growth and delivering a better quality of life for people in the bottom 30 or 40% of the income distribution. And if you contrast that with Australia, Australia's taken its economic growth and it's invested in its population. It's invested in healthcare, it's invested in education. And I think that's a big difference in terms of how people feel about growth and everything that comes with it, free trade and open borders and things. And obviously, when we talk about equity, we're talking about equity along multiple lines that could be, obviously in the US, racial equity is a very important line along which we want to think about equity. Income is another one, gender might be another one, linguistic groups is another possible one, depending upon the country. So what is this hybrid idea? Basically, it's that markets, government, and community have different comparative advantages. So you see, I come from an economics tradition, so I like the idea of comparative advantage. Markets are really, really good at coordination and allocation. In a complicated world where there's millions and millions of products that are being sold, central planning doesn't work. We learned this in the last 70 years. What works is markets. Markets do a really good job of coordinating demand and supply to balance benefits with costs, and they do a really good job of communicating information about the scarcity of things and the value of things. Market prices adjust very quickly to external circumstances, much more quickly than any government planner can. So if we look at governments, what are governments good at? Well, governments are good at providing goods that are like public goods and goods like education that are goods in their own right. And the market is going to underprovide those things. Governments are powerful. Governments can do things that markets can't do. Apple can't make you buy an iPhone, but the government can make you pay tax. And if you don't pay tax, they can put you in jail. So government has this coercive power to tax and transfer and to regulate. It has much more power than markets do. But of course, that power can be also misused. What are communities good at? Communities are good at local knowledge. They're good at tapping into people's beliefs about fairness and morality and how they should behave. It's often remarked that even though you might see litter along the highway, you don't usually see litter when you're walking down the street in front of your house in a neighborhood in Australia, because community polices that. People don't want to be seen throwing garbage on the street in front of their neighbors. Whereas on a highway, nobody sees you. It doesn't mean people are good in one situation and bad in another. It's just that the community does a good job of getting people to buy into common values. And then each of these places have their weaknesses, right? So markets can fail. Sometimes they produce unintended consequences. Markets don't care about equity. They just produce stuff and let the chips fall where they may. And some people can find markets to be sort of atomizing and not very personable, and they don't really feel like it resonates with their idea of humanity. Governments obviously have well-documented problems. They're susceptible to capture and corruption, and they can be very, very inefficient. Milton Friedman famously said, if we put the government in charge of the Sahara Desert, there'd be a shortage of sand in 5 years. So the idea of government failure, that governments might not always produce good outcomes, is also an important problem. And of course, the problem with community is it's small scale and they have weak powers of enforcement. So what you want to do is you want to try to design policy that recognizes the weaknesses of all these things and recognizes the strengths of all these things. And I mentioned the word ideology a couple times, but the subtitle of our book is I guess, rather provocatively, public policy beyond ideology, because we find often that public debates tend to get bogged down on what look like ideological grounds. So some people say, markets, markets, markets. Some people say, no markets, no markets, no markets. But if you look at it kind of sensibly from the outside, you would say, well, markets do all these things really well, so let's use them when they work really well, but then they don't do these other things really well. So let's think about what can government do to come in around the market and kind of soften some of these problems that the market can have, soften these inefficiencies, soften these market failures, and soften these inequitable outcomes. So let me just give you quickly a couple of examples, and then I'll wrap up, and I'm happy to talk about these themes more in the Q&A. And how about, Simone, I see your question about tax reform, and how about I take that one on in the Q&A after the talk? I think that's a good question, and I'm more than happy to talk about that. So let me talk about hybrids for a second. So So one example is Denmark has a very unique unemployment insurance system called flexicurity, which seems to work very well. And the idea behind flexicurity is that you want to allow labor markets to adjust to external circumstances. And what that means is you want companies to be able to fire workers easily, and you want them to be able to hire workers easily. And the second thing it means is that you want to help workers make that transition, and you want to help workers to gain new skills that they might need to get a new job. So we know that if we just leave the labor market up to market forces, we end up with short-sighted behavior in terms of workers not investing in retraining and companies not training workers. And we know that workers tend to under-insure against unemployment. People tend not to save money in case they end up unemployed. And then, and so the private market has a failure. We know that government policies around labor markets can often have high government failure. If we say to people, don't worry if you lose your job, we'll give you lots of money, then we take away the incentive for people to get a job and to go out and look for a new job when they lose one. And government's usually not very good at picking what kinds of things people should do their training in. The Australian government just last week announced a whole bunch of changes to the amount of subsidy that they give for different educational degrees. And they've completely misunderstood the purpose of higher education in doing that. So it's a perfect example of governments just not being in a very good position to judge what kind of education people should be doing. So what do the Danes do? And why is what they do interesting? So first of all, what they do is they focus on income security instead of job security. So in Denmark, the labor market's very unregulated. It's very easy to hire people. It's very easy to fire people. This is efficient. This is good market efficiency. It creates competition. It creates creative destruction. Obsolete jobs disappear quickly, and new jobs reappear quickly, and there's low transaction costs for labor and for companies. So government then intervenes around that market. So it leaves the prices alone. It doesn't try to control the wages. It doesn't try to control the jobs. But instead, what it says to people is, look, if you lose your job, we'll give you a lot of money to replace the income you're losing for a short period of time. It used to be for a year, now it's a bit shorter. But during that time, you have to undertake education and training, and you have to learn new skills. And then at the end of that period of time, the income support falls to a very low level. So there's a strong end point where people are expected to become reemployed. And this is basically compensating workers for the kind of negative impacts of the free market in the labor market. And unions, in Denmark, union rates are like 70%, and unions basically work to protect both the employed and the unemployed. They explicitly feel like they're representing the people who don't have jobs. So the unions work together with education providers and with firms to identify what are the skills that we need, what do we need more of, and how can we train people up in those skills. And again, this is like tapping into community, right? Community has good local knowledge. They know what's needed. They can do it in a human way. And so this is the kind of human element. And so you're bringing together this market element, this government element, and this community element, trying to use the best of each and trying to mitigate the worst of the others with those policies. And I think this is a policy that a lot of countries could emulate. And very interestingly, when they survey Danish workers and they say, are you worried about automation? Danish workers are less worried about automation than workers in any other country in the world. And it's because they have this system that, no, they're not, if automation happens and they lose their job, they'll get income support and they'll be able to retrain and they'll be able to find another job, right? And so particularly as we move to a world where we're going to potentially have more automation, more job change, we don't want to stop that from happening. We need to embrace that, and we need to use that, for the reasons of economic growth and efficiency. But we need to set up systems that protect workers and will allow them to find new things to do. There are areas in society where mostly you want markets or mostly you want government. And really it just depends upon the kind of the blend of the two. So, healthcare is an area where you want a mix of government and private, but you probably want the government to be pretty strong. patients don't know much about what kind of treatment they should get, and it's hard for them to get information. People often are short-sighted when they think about investing in their health. If you don't have strong primary health, people will wait till they're too sick to go to the doctor. So that suggests that you want a lot of public intervention, but you also want private things that ensure that people don't overuse the system, and you want private elements that create innovation and competition. And I won't talk a lot about health, but in the book we have a chapter we talk about the Australian healthcare system, and the Australian healthcare system actually does a pretty good job of combining elements of both, particularly compared to Canada or the UK. The idea in the book is that knowledge underpins hybrids. So the 20th century was about rhetoric and theory. There were lots of arguments about ideology. We had capitalism versus communism. We had all these ideological debates. We've learned from 100 years of theory and evidence about what things work and what things don't work. And now we're embarking on the 21st century, which is going to be the data century. We have access to tons and tons of data, and we have access to it really fast. So we can very quickly ascertain which government programs are working, which ones aren't working, which government programs are being abused. And we've seen this in Australia with our responses to COVID-19 and the JobKeeper program. The government has very quickly been able to review that program, find out which workers are being helped, which workers are being harmed, which sectors of the economy are being helped, which are being harmed, and it allows us to update policy. And we have a lot of powerful tools of evidence-based policy and statistical techniques. And that is where I will pass over to my colleague, Nicholas Biddle. Okay, Anna, I went 17 minutes. Is that okay? Did I stick to the...
That's perfectly fine. Thank you so much, Professor. And now we welcome Professor Nicholas Biddle, Associate Director of the ANU Center for Social Research and Methods. Good evening, Professor. Would you tell us a bit about your work and the topic that you're addressing tonight?
Sure, no, more than happy to. So I think it's a really nice segue from the end of Bob's presentation around the use of data and the need for kind of high quality evaluations to support a hybrid model. An ideological model doesn't require data. You kind of know what you expect to find and you don't really care what the data says. Whereas a hybrid model which tries to use a combination of the market, the community sector and the government sector is heavily reliant on data and evidence to tweak and adjust as we're going. So one of my roles is I'm on the National Data Advisory Council, which is an organisation set up by government, which reports to cabinet, to give advice to government on how to make data available to both within government as well as to external researchers. So what I'm going to talk about is essentially the extent to which we're reliant on trust from the public to pursue a policy agenda which is evidence-based and which meets the aims which Bob has talked about.
Okay, I was going to ask if you agreed with Professor Breunig about this being the data century, but I think that it's self-explanatory after what you...
Look, I think what I would say is there's a lot of data out there, but not everyone has access to the right data. And some of that data is being held within kind of silos, either within the public sector or within the private sector. So the potential is there for it to be the data century. Whether it turns out to be the data century is a little bit reliant on the extent to which we open up in a relatively safe way.
Okay, so let's watch your presentation. And for the attendees, if you have any questions for our panelists, please type it into the Q&A and we are going to address it in the end.
So hopefully people should be seeing the screen now. And if not, I guess people will let me know during the in the chat and the Q&A. So Anna Paula, we're good with seeing the screen?
Looks good to me.
Perfect, great. And I also wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Matthew Gray, Ben Edwards, Dineth Marasingh, Steve McKecken, and James Zhang. So this is essentially pulling together a few bits of research which kind of touch on issues with trust in government, but especially around trust in government with regards to data. And what I'll try and do also is present some new results which haven't been shown before, so a premiere, so to speak, where we look at data with regards to COVID and policy responses with regard to COVID. So as mentioned, to do good policy, we need to have access to and make use of high quality data. So Bob talked about data for evaluations and adjusting policy, but also policy design and the administration of policies to make sure that we're meeting that efficiency criteria which Bob talked about. But in order to make use of that data, we need to maintain a social license. So essentially a social license is the implicit consent which the general public gives to both us as researchers, but also the license which the general public gives to government to make use of their data in a way which improves their outcomes both as individual but also as a society. And so I've got some data here, a few slides with some summary statistics, and these are from surveys which the ANU runs as part of the ANU poll series. So the good thing about this data is it's on a nationally representative sample of Australians, but it's also a longitudinal data set. So what we're able to do is see how individual views are changing through time. And we use this data not only to track outcomes, but also to track attitudes and also engagement with government. So what this data here gives is it's a summary of some findings from October 2018, where we asked people about essentially what they think the Commonwealth government, so it's the Australian government, should or should not be able to do with regards to their own data. So the black and the dark grey are people who essentially are supportive of use of data for these particular policy goals. So to improve outcomes, to evaluate effectiveness, and to make sure people aren't missing out. And almost exclusively, the Australian public is very supportive of government and researchers to use data in that way. And to design a better policy apparatus. The problem is that while the general public is supportive, they don't necessarily trust government to be able to do that effectively and safely. So we also asked the extent to which people agreed that the government could essentially do the things which are required to have a safe data infrastructure. So could they respond quickly and effectively to a data breach? Can they prevent data being hacked? Can they be trusted to use data responsibly? And is government open and honest about how data is collected, used, and shared? And on the right, the white bars and the light grey are the percent of people who agree that government is able to do those things, and not many people do. So less than half of our sample think that government could do any of, or less than 40% think that government is able to do the things which we'd hope government does in order to design a policy environment like the one which Bob talked about in his presentation. So we want government to use data, we just don't trust them to be able to do it safely. And we also asked not just about government, but also about level of trust in other organisations. So we asked about the Commonwealth government, the state and territory governments, as well as a range of private and community institutions. And one of the things which we found quite important is that, yes, government is more trusted than the private sector. And that's an important point when we come to kind of Bob's point about the mix between the market and government and the community sector is that in certain domains, the private sector isn't trusted as much as the public service, or as the public sector. So, and particular, this won't be a surprise to many, social media companies have one of the lowest levels of trust with regards to data. But university sector has higher levels of trust than government, and our Bureau of Statistics, which is within government but is a statutory agency and is in some way independent from the political arm of government, has the highest trust of all. But still, the last two slides kind of highlight a very low level of trust. And when we did this initial analysis in 2018 and analyzed the data last year, it was a reasonably sobering finding. But things have changed, and the world has changed quite rapidly. And there's been two events in Australia which I think have dramatically changed back and forth the extent to which government, the extent to which the general public trust government, both with their data and in general. One of these, which is not, or which is also, it has been experienced by Brazil, is the bushfires which occurred in Australia over our summer, essentially December to January. More hectares burned in Australia than ever occurred in the past. Almost 3/4 of Australians were either directly or indirectly affected by those bushfires, with almost half of the Australian population affected by smoke from those fires. Now we know that in Brazil there was the fires in the Amazon, which had very devastating effects on both the indigenous peoples, but also the environment in Brazil, but nowhere near the same level of effect on urban populations as we found in Australia. And government did quite poorly with regards to the bushfires, at least the federal government. And I'll show that in a second. Since then, though, and the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has essentially reversed that trend. So in Australia, we've had very few deaths from COVID-19 and very few infections. And for that reason, which is not unique, there's a number of countries, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Japan, some of the Scandinavian countries, which have done relatively well. And now government, the support for government has, or the confidence in government, due to that very effective policy response, has improved. And we can see this in two ways. One is a change in the level of trust with regards to data. And data has been an integral part, as Bob mentioned, to the COVID-19 response. So this graph here, the gray bar is the same graph as I put up before. And whereas the hollow bars now are the same answer to the same question from the same respondents in May 2020. And what we can see is still not as high as we would like, but an improvement in trust with regards to use of data. But we can also see that more generally with regards to confidence in government. So what this graph here gives is essentially it follows four waves of data collection. And it gives a percent of people who have confidence in the federal government. This is a general confidence measure, not just with regards to data. And we can see the trends which I talked about playing out with regards to general confidence. In October, prior to the bushfires, relatively low levels of confidence, but not as bad as it was during January 2020 at the height of the bushfire crisis. And then improvements very dramatic improvements, more dramatic than I've seen with this type of data before, between January and April, and then slight improvements again between April and May. So essentially what we've found is that One crisis, the bushfire crisis, led to a dramatic decline in confidence. And another crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the spread throughout the world and to a lesser extent in Australia, and the government's relatively successful response to it, led to an improvement in confidence in the federal government. So why is that important? Why do we care about that? Governments obviously care about it because they get elected based on the confidence which the public has in them. But we as policymakers should also care. And the reason why we should care is because we also have some data which suggests that the policy apparatus, the ability to deliver and evaluate good policy, is directly impacted by the trust which the general public has with regards to government in general, but also with regards to data. And I'll show that with two policy interventions which try to fit within that hybrid model which Professor Breunig has talked about. So that is the consumer data right, as well as the rollout of the COVID Safe app. And I'll describe these very briefly and then show you some findings. So the consumer data right, essentially what the consumer data right is the consumers have, as the name suggests, a right to access their own data, which is held by both government as well as private sector organizations, to make sure that they have the best deal possible with regards to certain uses of certain essential services. So initially, it's with regards to energy, to banking, then it'll be expanded to energy and telecommunications, core parts of being a citizen. So the way it essentially works is you tell your bank or your phone company or your energy provider, I want my data. You give it to a third party and they find the best deal possible for you. But it's supported by government. It's underpinned by the safety regulations of government to make sure that your data isn't then being abused and used to harm you in terms of your access to services. So what we did in 2018, we also asked respondents about their potential use of this consumer data right. And the consumer data right is not only good for individuals, it's good to make markets effective. If individuals think that, if companies think that individuals are able to shop around and get the best price possible, then they're far more likely to be responsive and design their own offerings in a way which maximize consumer utility. So an effective delivery of the consumer data right is good for consumers and it's good as individuals, but it's also good for the economy as a whole. But what we find is that in order to participate in the consumer data right, individuals need to have a high level of trust in government. So the blue line gives the percent of people who think that they would use the consumer data right under three different forms of messaging. A neutral frame is just where we ask people whether they'd use the consumer data right. And then a negative or a gain frame is essentially where we talk about a negative frame is where we talk about the cost which you're avoiding, and a gain frame is when you talk about the benefits you'd get from using the consumer data right. And there's no difference between consumers based on trust with the neutral framing. So that's just a very bland statement about what the consumer data right is. But when we highlight the potential benefits, either as avoiding costs or as receiving gains, then there's a very large difference between those who trust government and those who don't trust government in their potential usage of the consumer data right. So what this essentially means, and this was an experimental test, so we can make pretty strong causal inference about the effect of the framing, the differential effect of framing based on trust. And what this essentially shows to us is if you want people to follow your message as a policymaker or as people involved in the policy process, then you need to have a high level of underlying trust. People won't listen to you if you don't have that trust to start with. And we also find that with the COVID Safe app. So the COVID Safe app is essentially a public-private partnership. It's hosted by it's an app which is provided by the major phone companies, Google and Apple, are supportive of or help provide the app to consumers. It's available on the major carriers and supported by the major telecommunication carriers, but it's delivered and designed by government. And essentially what the app does is that if you have downloaded the app and you keep your Bluetooth on, then if you come in contact with someone who's later been diagnosed to have been exposed to COVID-19, then you will receive a message and you'll be able to get yourself tested and treated if needs be. And the design of the app is it's designed to help the country open up and for people to be able to start interacting each other, knowing that if there is an outbreak, another outbreak, that it can be traced and people who have been infected can be isolated and treated. And when we asked in mid-May, about 44% of our sample had downloaded the app, which is a little bit higher than what was found by government. But the reason we have for that is we have a sample which is relatively comfortable. They do online surveys, so they're relatively comfortable downloading and using these types of apps. But what we find is that there's very big variation depending on whether you have confidence in government, in whether you will download and use that app. So the first bar, the 32.6%, is those who weren't confident in government in January or May, and weren't confident at all. The highest level, 55%, is those who are confident in both January and May, so confidence in both points in time. But the other interesting finding is that although the difference is small and we're unsure whether there's some uncertainty around the estimates, there is still differences between those who are confident in both January and May compared to those who are confident in May only and not confident in government in January. And what that says to us is there's lingering effects of negative decision-making by government or poor decision-making by government. Essentially what our data hints at is that the effect of a poor handling of the bushfire crisis makes it harder for government to design an effective policy response during the COVID period. So, data matters. Trust in government matters with regards to data, and there's ongoing effects of negative or policy failures with regards to the extent to which people will give their data over to governments, either through a consumer data right or through the COVID Safe app. And we've also found that for people sharing their health records with government. So what does that mean for leadership? Well, in our view, to ensure an effective policy delivery in the hybrid model like Bob has talked about, leaders need to be trusted. And that's leaders both within the political arm of government, so prime ministers or presidents or premiers, but also leaders in the public service and leaders in universities. So people who are front and center on delivering and evaluating policy. To do this, leaders need to be non-ideological, and while being ideological can certainly help support amongst the hardcore believers, a non-ideological approach has been shown to be supported by a more general breadth of the population. Leaders need to listen and be open to new ways of doing things. They need to pick and choose what works and what doesn't work, both from their own country's experience, but also what Bob talked about from Denmark, from other countries' experience. They need to experiment. And we've shown that high trust in government is supported by governments which evaluate and test things. They need to use that evidence to find out what works and what doesn't, and they need to make sure that evidence is available openly and transparently. So I might finish it there and end my screen sharing and hand it back to you, Anna Paula.
Thank you so much, Professor. And just on the last points you made, I'm going to open the Q&A session before we invite one of our attendees to speak as well. But there's a question exactly about that, about the trust in the data. One of our guests say that despite we having every day more data available, we have seen a rise during the last years and months of a disbelief in the data and in science in general. What do you see as the main problem that causes this disbelief? And are we as scientists communicating with society on the correct way? I think that links with what you just mentioned in your last slide.
Yeah, look, that's a fantastic question. I might have a first go, and then I think Bob would have potentially add to that as well. So look, I totally agree that data isn't just data. There's various types of data, and using poor quality data or using data in a poor way can have a negative effect. And we've certainly seen that with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's been a retraction of a number of papers in very high quality journals. So in the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and they weren't driven by necessarily, the results weren't necessarily wrong. They might be, they weren't, they might not be. But the reason why they were retracted is because the researchers could no longer guarantee that that data would be shared and made available to others to validate those findings. So it's not just about whether the data is good or bad. It's also about how open people are with that data. So if you want people to trust your use of data, then make that data available to others. We host the Australian Data Archive in our centre. So we release our data every time we run a survey. We put our data out on exactly the same day in which we release our findings. If you find something which is different to ours, if you have a different interpretation of our analysis, great. You have access to that data. You can challenge it. You can push science forward. And I think that's a good model.
Robert, would you like to add something?
I mean, Nick's hit the nail on the head. I think it's a combination of education and transparency.
Thank you. I do have one question that relates a lot to what you explained to us about the Danish flexicurity, Robert. Is the Danish flexicurity system easily transferable to other nations like Brazil or Australia? And if it works so well, why hasn't it been adopted more broadly?
Yeah, I guess, that's a good question. I think it's dangerous to take things that work well in one country and just drop them into another country as if they're going to work well. Like, sometimes people say, oh, Finland has great PISA scores. Let's be more like Finland. And what does that mean? Does that mean we should all speak Finnish? Should we drink more vodka? Like, I'm not quite sure what the, how to interpret that. But I guess instead I offer it as pointing the road to the kinds of reforms that you might think about. So government trying to control wages, government trying to control which kind of jobs are going to be done and which kind of jobs aren't going to be done are really bad policies for efficiency. Government putting in place support structures that enable workers to change jobs and that enable workers to get new training in partnership with education and corporations are good policies, right? And what that will look like is going to be different in different kind of countries. I don't know why it hasn't been more widely adopted, but I actually think part of the problem, at least in Australia, is unions. Unions tend to view themselves as working exclusively for their employed members rather than working. So Denmark has a small number of very large unions which view themselves as representing the working classes very largely. Australia, we have unions that represent particular sectors. So just for example, a teachers union, the only thing they care about is people who are teaching today. They don't care about future teachers or people who could be teaching, or they protect their members, right? And that's fine. They're a member organization. They're doing their job, but just the way that unions have emerged in Denmark has been different than Australia. I think that's potentially one answer to that.
Another question here is that ideology has been pointed out as harmful to efficient policies. How is it possible to mitigate the ideology factor on the building processes of data that is used to design new policies?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question because ideology is often a way to kind of rally the faithful, as Nicholas pointed out. I think you can do it in a couple of ways. One is I think a large part of it is a commitment by government to create a professional public service that is committed to the public good and committed to, I'll say, scientific inquiry, for the lack of a better word. And I think a second thing is just to try to be broad when you design policies. So you know, I do a lot of work in tax reform. If you look at countries that have successfully undertaken tax reform, the way they've done it is they've brought in people from the community sector, people from business, people from government, people from the opposition, as well as the ruling party, and people from academia. And if you get a lot of broad set of views in the room, then I think you can move past ideology, because you can focus on the things that need changing and the things where people agree about the need for change. And that's also then a kind of way to forge compromise.
Right. One of the questions that we got here is asking about the close the gap policy. How is it going here in Australia? And if there are any lessons learned so far to share. The person who sent the question mentions that there is also a gap with indigenous people in Brazil. Do you have information on that?
Do you want me to go, Bob?
Yeah.
Yep.
Nick and I published a paper last year about financial disadvantage in indigenous households, but Nick has worked much more on this area than I have, so I'll let him go.
Yeah, look, it's a fantastic question, and I guess in a very quick summary, probably closing the gap has not gone as well as hoped, but probably better than you might have feared, or the headlines might suggest. And one of the challenges with a closing the gap policy is you're trying to hit a moving target. So Indigenous outcomes in Australia, the closing the gap policy very explicitly compares those to non-Indigenous outcomes. So what we've found in the last maybe decade or so since the introduction of the closing the gap policy is that Indigenous employment has improved, Indigenous income has improved, life expectancy has gone up, and infant mortality in particular has gone down quite substantially, and early childhood education participation has gone up. And they would unequivocally be good things from a policy perspective. The problem is, for some of these, the non-Indigenous population has also improved, and sometimes at a slightly faster rate. So I think the challenge with the closing the gap policy is articulating targets which are of relevance to the population, which are realistic in terms of what's possible to achieve, but also have a mix of both absolute improvements as well as relative improvements. And I guess the final point to note is where the closing the gap policy has failed has been when the targets have not been designed in a way which are of relevance to the population of interest. So missing from the closing the gap targets is exposure to the criminal justice system. And what we have found is that Indigenous Australians are much more likely to have been incarcerated, and that's worsening through time. And secondly, there's no targets for the non-Indigenous population. All the onus is on the Indigenous population. A target like, we should all learn an Indigenous language. or we should all know more about our Indigenous history. That's a target which puts some onus on the rest of us, but also I think can have some small effects on the outcomes for the Indigenous population.
Thank you so much, Professor. A question that I would like to give to you both as well is about the fintech sector. You may have seen here in our Q&A, we do have a question that our attendee says that the size of the Australian fintech sector was estimated in 250 million in 2015. Since then, there was a huge growth, and they mentioned some names here. We've seen the same fintech boom happening in the Scandinavian markets. And do you think these have a positive impact as a part of hybrid? If so, what do you think are the key things governments have done to help that? And what could Brazil learn?
So I'm not sure I'm an expert on the fintech sector, but from a general point of view, but I have spent a lot of time studying innovation and entrepreneurship. In the book that I wrote, we have a couple of chapters about the kinds of things governments can do. And I'm from the US originally, and I have a couple of friends who have been involved in kind of the innovation entrepreneurial world, some of whom have done very well. And I think, you know, what governments can do, I guess, are really three things, right? One is invest in education. If you look at so much of the innovation and entrepreneurship that comes out of, whether it's Australia or Scandinavia or the US, it comes about because of university sector education. I mean, this is a big spillover from university sectors. If you think about invention, you know, big inventions, internet, Wi-Fi, all these things are coming out of university research. So I think that's, and I have a friend who spends his job trying to commercialize ideas, and all he does is read academic journals. So he just goes and looks at what academics are working on. When he finds something he thinks is commercializable, he calls them up and he says, hey, let's found a company. So that's one thing. The second thing is your tax settings are important. You don't want to have tax settings that are punitive for startup businesses. So you need to have, it needs to be, if people are going, first of all, you need to not take too much tax away from them when they're successful. And secondly, you need to have provisions where they're allowed to write off losses and they're allowed to lose money, and they can go bankrupt. Because in order to innovate, so the biggest, the most common factor of every successful entrepreneur is they've already failed at least once in doing a business, right? So you want people to be able to try things, fail, and not have a penalty follow them around for their whole life. That's really important. And the third thing is that government does a really bad job of deciding which industries should be promoted by the country. And Brazil's had plenty of experience with, you know, government choosing industries, and then they're very inefficient and they cost a lot of money. But what governments can do is when they see an emerging comparative advantage, so governments observe that there's something like a fintech sector that's emerging in Australia, and then government can say, all right, that clearly is something where we have a comparative advantage, there's some activity going on. What can the government do, again, around the market to kind of help the market do better? And that could be venture capital programs, it could be mentoring programs, it could be innovation hubs that government produces, it could be co-locating similar people and giving them a break on rent so that they can be located together and share ideas. And none of those things are the government saying, you know, Brazil is going to produce cars, right? Instead, it's saying, oh, you know, there's something that we seem to be doing pretty well. What can we do to kind of help people? What infrastructure is needed? Maybe it's a road, maybe it's better internet connection or whatever. So I guess those are the things that I would say in general about how governments can encourage innovation, whether it's fintech or other.
So maybe I might just add a final point, and it's maybe a little bit self-serving because it kind of follows on from some of the points that Giles was making, is that access to data is another thing which government can do. So we know that a lot of startup companies are heavily they start off information poor, and they can become information rich quite quickly, and sometimes it can go too far, and they can become a monopoly with regards to information. And what that does is it stops new entrants into the marketplace. So the reason why Google keeps getting richer is not necessarily because Google is designing better products, but because they have more information than their competitors. The reason why Apple is still making iPhones and doing very well out of it is not necessarily because they've got the best people working there, although they sometimes do. It's also that they know what consumers want, and they get that information from their own sales, but also buying up other countries. So one of the ways I think government can reduce monopolies, which encourage entrance into markets, is thinking about more democratic sharing of information, either government information or information held by other firms.
Thank you so much, Professor. Our next question here, and after this one, I'll invite one of the attendees to join us, but I think this is $1 million question, or maybe $1 billion or $1 trillion question here. We received a question from that asks, what is the best recipe for post-pandemic tax reform? $1 trillion question on the table. I would like to hear from both of you.
So I've written a lot about this in Australia. I'm not I'm not an expert on the Brazilian tax system, but so I think I guess a couple of things I would say. First of all, is that you probably don't want to make changes to your tax system in the middle of the pandemic. It's not a good time to actually change things, because government, one of government's roles in moments like this is to provide certainty and stability in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty. And so changing the rules of the game is not the right thing to do. However, fundamental tax reform, and by that I mean changing the mix of taxation in your country so that your tax system is poised for economic growth, is something that can help countries recover from COVID-19. And now is the right time to start that conversation. And in fact, now is the right time, given the sense of crisis, now is actually the right time to bring all the different players around the table. It's a time where people actually want to be seen as contributing to making things better. People don't want to be seen as part of the problem. There are enough other problems. And so that actually allows you to bring together groups that you might not usually be able to get around the table. And we've seen that in Australia with the states and the federal government sitting around the table, with union leaders talking with business leaders, much more than we had a year ago. So I think now is a good time to start a process of tax reform. And then I think, so in Brazil, I mean, you have a lot of, my understanding is you still have taxes on goods that come from different states within Brazil. And the first place I would look would be to get rid of those kinds of taxes. So you want the free flow of goods and people across states, again, to take advantage of trade and growth and economic growth. You then want to think about whether your tax system is actually encouraging innovation, encouraging work. So you want a more efficient system. And then you also then want to think about how you can deal with equity concerns. And really, you kind of want to use your tax, as a general statement, you want to use your tax settings mostly about efficiency. So you mostly want to have your tax settings be about helping economic growth and helping economic output. Sometimes that means that your tax settings may not favor the poor. And then you want to think about using your transfer system to counteract that for poor people, because the efficiency costs of dealing with equity through the tax system are very high relative to dealing through the transfer system. And particularly for a country like Brazil, I think that it's, one of the things that Australia, I think, does very effectively is we give a lot of what we give to lower income people, not so much just in terms of cash, but in terms of goods. So our health system spends a lot of money on people in the lower parts of the income distribution. Our education system spends a lot of money there. And so another way to transfer well-being to people who are less well off is not necessarily to think about it in terms of money, but to think about it in terms of what are the things they need to have access to the opportunities of society. So making sure that you're investing properly in healthcare and education and those kind of things. So, you know, I mean, that's a very high level recipe, but I think that's the recipe you're going for. And then countries need to look specifically at what are the, you know, different countries have different, you know, different settings. But I think the place you start is by saying, you know, what are the most inefficient things that we're currently doing, and how can we get rid of those and replace them with more efficient things?
Nicholas, would you like to add something?
Just a couple of minor points. And one of the projects which Bob and I have collaborated on is with the Australia Tax Office about, I guess, more evidence-based collection of taxes and around the use of behavioural insights to make sure that the tax system is operating effectively. And I think there's one thing to have a rule or a policy setting, but if your implementation of that is not evidence-based, then you're not going to be able to be bringing in the revenue which allows you to I guess meet those transfer needs which Bob mentioned. And I guess another I guess general point is tax things which don't move as much as possible. So that's a general point. And so land as opposed to transactions, or and not taxing things which you want to support.
All right. Now I would like to invite one of our attendees to join this panel and talk for 2 or 3 minutes. Our next speaker is Brazilian alumni Paulo Nascimento, who I had the pleasure to meet while he was here at the ANU. And he will bring some economic perspectives from a Brazilian point of view. And if I remember correctly, he was studying income contingent loans and financing tools while here in Australia. So I would like to welcome Paulo to our panel and invite him to speak for 2 or 3 minutes. Just checking if Paulo was able to join us.
Hello, Ana Paula.
Olá, Paulo.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me well now?
We can hear you. We can't see you yet. Would you turn on your camera?
Oh, sure. Let's see, start my video. Now, yeah.
There you are. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me to participate a little bit. And well, yes, I have studied income contingent loans while I was in Australia, and I have been keeping this research here in Brazil. I did my thesis on this topic, and I used data from Brazil, but applied a methodology developed by Professor Lorraine Deedon, who is a former ANU student, and now she is a professor at University College of London. And Professor Bruce Chapman supervised my thesis, and Associate Professor Timothy Higgins was part of the examination board, and did give me plenty of useful advice. And well, I have been trying to convince the Brazilian government to pass legislative reforms to introduce income contingent loans in Brazil for a while. I work in a government-based think tank in Brazil called the IPEA, Institute for Applied Economic Research. And the last maybe 5 years, I have been in touch with the policymakers, eventually with congressmen and congresswomen, but basically with policymakers from the government. And they are pretty much convinced, although governments change and some of the policymakers change too. So it's a continuous restart. But I think nowadays it's a little bit more known in Brazil how income contingent loans work, at least inside the government. The next step is probably to convince the Congress to discuss that and convince the community. Here in Brazil, because we have two separate sectors in the higher education, I mean, a huge private sector and a smaller public sector, it has been much easier to discuss income contingent loans as a reform for the current government provided student loans for students studying the private sector. The initial legislative reforms were passed in 2017. The government is still struggling to introduce because it has been trying to do a second best, which is not involve the internal revenue system in collecting income contingent repayments. But at least these reforms are in the agenda for the student loans provided to students in the private sector. It's much more difficult to discuss that in the public sector. And so it's probably the second step. And with the pandemic, it has been discussed also income contingent loans for other applications. I have just released a booklet with 3 colleagues from IPEA discussing income contingent loans as a way to provide financial help for small enterprises. So this is a possibility. In the literature, we can find recent ideas on how to use actually income contingent loans for basic income, for individual basic income. So there are several applications that could be discussed, and I hope eventually discuss in Brazil. And I saw that someone from the Ministry of Economy was asking about post-pandemic tax reforms. ICS can be part of these reforms also as a way to provide now financial help for individuals and companies and enterprises, and have part of these disbursements paid back in the future after the pandemic through the tax system as an additional, as a surcharge in the taxes people and enterprise have to pay.
But
so
only on those moments when they have income, right? That's the difference.
Yes, income or they're going to have some source of income. So this is basically my agenda. I also do some research in education, in higher education, and education in general. And I'm very concerned of how to actually involve the different agents in any reform, because I mean, we have first, from my point of view, working in a think tank that is in the government, inside the government. We have first to address any topic within the government, and that's a work to convince policymakers from different sectors of the government on specific policy, especially when it's a new policy for the country. And it's another job. It's maybe harder to make this word spread across the community and the society in general, and in the Congress as well. So that would be good to hear a little bit from the panelists how this what's the best strategy to make new policy or policy reforms from the start up to the point that they are approved in the Congress and they are there happening. So how to involve community, how to involve Congress from the government once you have some new policy design, and that comes from bottom up actually, not from the politicians or the top decision makers, but actually from the government structure. And you have to pass these reforms somehow, you know, to make the policy work.
If our panelists have any have any suggestions or any information for Paulo. Paulo, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to see you again. And we have in the chat a request where we can find your booklet. So if you could type that in the chat for our attendees. Okay, thank you so much. And I'll pass to our panelists again. So how can you help build policy from the inside?
I think in some ways it's hard. I think one of the challenges is that, at least in Australia, politicians, I think politicians 30 or 40 years ago had advisors who were thinking about policy. And I think today politicians mostly have advisors who just think about communication. It's partly that the media attention and media cycle is much more intense than it used to be. It's probably social media. It's probably the 24-hour news cycle. And so I think it can be hard to get good policy ideas, particularly some, you know, kind of sort of technical ideas like income contingent loans, which are actually really important and have worked really well in Australia and are working well in other countries. And in fact, we have a chapter in our book about income contingent loans as well, and it's a good example of a hybrid policy. And the, you know, so I guess what I would say instead is to start building the coalition of people who are interested in reform, of people who are like-minded. Find those people in the sector you're working in. Find those people in you know, I do a lot of stuff in tax, and so I have a group of people that I communicate with who come from consulting firms, from government, from community sector. I get them together once every 6 months, and we kind of talk about reform ideas, and we educate each other, and we come up with things. And the reason I'm doing that is that when the time is right, then we'll be ready. And I think partly that's it, is that it's hard to sort of knock on politicians' door and say, hey, you should do reform X. But if you do all the groundwork and all the legwork, then something happens, and then suddenly politicians are looking for an answer, and you can say, here you go, here's this, we thought about this really great policy that's going to answer this, and we've done a whole bunch of work, and here we've worked out what it can look like, and we've worked out how you can transition from the current system. Then you can really have impact, right? But you've got to do that work in advance, and it's hard work, and you don't know if the opportunity is going to happen 2 years from now or 20 years from now.
So I might add a couple of things as well. So, I mean, I think both Bob and I are kind of quantitative social scientists, kind of economists by training. But at least in my view, I don't think quantitative evidence is ever enough. So a number of the evaluations which Bob and I have been involved in, we've also had qualitative data collection as part of it. And the reason why we do that is because it helps our interpretation of the quantitative evidence, but it also helps to tell a more convincing story and narrative. And I think with income contingent loans, it's talking about future discount rates and you know, economic returns to education is important, but telling a story about someone who's able to go to university for the first time in anyone in their family can really tell a more powerful story to the people you're trying to convince. And it does take a long time, and as Bob said, sometimes the time suits you. And I think Professor Chapman would be the first to admit that he was very lucky in that his timing was spot on. Not through any necessarily planning from him. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And that's led to a very effective policy intervention. So another example, which I think would be useful from both the positive and a negative example, is the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme was a very drastically different way to provide support for people with a disability. And it took a number of years for people in the disability sector working really, really hard to make the case. And then there just happened to be a minister who was ambitious and wanted to make a mark. And it was implemented. And for the most part, it's had a positive effect. But I guess the negative aspects of the National Disability Insurance Scheme is people didn't always think about the implementation side of things. And I think we as researchers are quite good at coming up with the big ideas, income contingent loan, or investments in early childhood education, or a change of the tax and transfer system, or whatever the case may be. But the implementation matters, and how you're going to deliver something is what makes that policy stick.
So taking into consideration that all this matters in terms of something working or not, our next question here is, how can governments earn and maintain the confidence of constituents? And given it's the same government, same leadership, why do you think there have been such dramatic swings in such a short time in Australia?
Yeah, so I might have a first go, and then Bob can give his thoughts. And it is building a little bit on what Bob said about ideology. And one of the big differences between the Commonwealth government's response to the bushfire crisis, and at least the early stages of the Commonwealth government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, is the bushfire crisis was an ideologically driven response. It wasn't an evidence-based response. And that can excite, as I said, the true believers, but it doesn't build confidence in those who don't necessarily support your side of government. And one of the things we found with our data is there actually wasn't that big a change in the level of confidence of the coalition government supporters for the coalition. What we found is an increasing confidence amongst those who supported the other side of government, and I think the reason is because every press conference which the Prime Minister gives, there's an expert on COVID-19. There's a public health expert standing next to him, willing to answer questions, and to provide the data to support those questions. That didn't happen with the bushfire crisis. Essentially, there was government saying that it's to do with, and then they chose their previous ideological stand.
Yeah, I think what's incredibly impressive about the Morrison government in Australia in the COVID crisis is their willingness to do things that 9 months ago they would have said, we will never, ever do that, right? And I actually think that's just good old-fashioned leadership, and people actually recognize it, right? You know, you adapt when circumstances change, and you do what needs to be done, and you deliver victories for people. And at the end of the day, governments, the way they get people on board is by delivering wins, right? They, you know, whether those are in education or health or any kind of policy. And then I think people, you're always going to have, you know, fringes of people who will argue with you about anything. But if you can get, you know, wins for the middle of the population, I think your status will grow, and that's what we've seen with Morrison.
And we are going to our last questions now, because our time is almost up. We've had a great discussion today. Question about unions, Professor Breunig. In Brazil, unions only represent union members. With the cuts in compulsory contributions from labor reforms, the unions are increasingly closed. And in your opinion, what's the importance then of unions in facing economic crisis like the one Brazil is facing now?
Yeah, I think so. unions are important in terms of, workers are very dispersed and firms are very concentrated. And there are certain times where, both in terms of kind of equalizing the power relationship between workers and firms, unions can be useful. And there's also times where, just in terms of coordination and communication, unions have a big role to play. What we saw in Europe after the global financial crisis, I think, is somewhat instructive, which is the countries that had unions that viewed themselves as having a very broad mandate, like in Denmark or in France or in Germany, basically worked very collaboratively with companies to try to do things that were in the interests of their members. So lots of unions in France negotiated 11-month contracts instead of 12-month contracts. So everybody took a month of unpaid, an extra month of unpaid vacation, and that allowed firms to continue operating and not have job loss. In some countries where there was kind of more oppositional unions to firms, we didn't see that happen, and we saw job loss. So I think unions have a role to play, but just like governments, just like firms, that role needs to be flexible, and it needs to match the conditions that are happening in society. And I think sometimes unions can get bogged down in rigid ideological positions, and then what often ends up happening is they become irrelevant, right? So the membership shrinks, and they're not having a voice at the table, and I think that's probably a bad thing.
And I would like to finalize with a question about education, because in Brazil, the federal public universities are essentially funded by the government. And Professor Breunig, you mentioned how science innovation should be stimulated. So having said that, in which extent hybrid policies are practicable in areas like higher education and science? And more specifically, should the government continue to be the main university's supporter, even considering hybrid policies ideas? What are lessons from Australia?
I mean, I think the big lesson is that so most of the benefit of university education, or at least a large part of it, goes to the individuals who get the university education. And so it seems not unfair to ask people to contribute to paying for their education. The question is, how do you finance that, right? How do you make sure that you don't want to create a system where the only people who can get a university education are the wealthy? And that's where that's where our income contingent loan scheme has been so successful, because it's allowed universities to charge fees. Charging fees has brought more resources to the university. More resources has meant better research, better teaching, better outcomes for students. I've taught in France. I lived in France for a few years. I taught at French universities, which are free, and they're horrible. There's 600 students enrolled for a class in a room of 150. Teachers do whatever they want, and there are no evaluations. The computer labs don't have any computers, and they don't work. And if students go and complain, they say, well, it's free, right? What do you have to complain about? In Australia, people pay. If things aren't good, they complain, right? Paying actually gives you a lot of power to say, hang on, this isn't a good thing, right? But then it's how do you work out the financing that doesn't disadvantage people. But when I think about the equality aspects of education, I think the investment is much more at a lower level than university. And then the university level is more about, I guess, innovation and those kinds of things. So, you want to make sure you're investing properly at the primary and secondary level as well. So.
Nicholas, any comments on that?
No, look, I don't have too much to add. I guess the other thing I would say is that government is not always the best at deciding which direction universities should take, and I think there's a degree to which government's role is to provide information to universities, to students, and to researchers to help them make the most informed decisions. So one, I guess, small innovation which I think Brazil could consider is the graduate destination survey, the quality in learning and teaching survey, which the Australian government runs, and that allows students to make a good judgment about what's the best university for them, and also universities to say, oh, actually, we're not doing very well in engineering, so let's lift our game here.
Well, thank you so much. So I would like to thank our panelists, and I hope the attendees enjoyed the presentations as much as I did today. And thank you for the opportunity to moderate this event in the name of the Brazilian alumni. I would like to invite my colleague Daniel Brown from the International Strategy and Partnerships at the ANU. He is part of a team dedicated to engagement with Brazil. And if you have any questions about the engagement of ANU in Brazil, please feel free to contact Danny Brown, who was helping us in the background here today. If you have any questions about admissions or how to join ANU, please send me a message. My name is Ana Paula, and I'll be very happy to help you. Our contacts are on the chat just now. So thanks again to our panelists. We are going to meet again next week on Tuesday to discuss leadership in diplomacy. Thank you for joining us today e até semana que vem. Boa noite a todos e tchau, tchau.
Thanks, everyone.